أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. Khutba Jumma Masjid have begun a spiritual treasures challenge wherein they have made an objective to read all of the books that have been translated into English of the promised Messiah ﷺ within a period of a couple of years. And this initiative is particularly a source of blessings in that not only does it give us the knowledge that the promised Messiah ﷺ imparted in his books, but it also gives us the spiritual treasures, that spiritual blessing that there is in reading his writings. Now, this initiative is particularly for Khutba, but I think others can participate in it as well because of its general beneficial nature. Because through it, it encourages us to read the books of the promised Messiah ﷺ, which is something that Hazur Yadawallah Ta'ala Aziz has repeatedly emphasized, and which is integral for our understanding what Ahmadiyyat and Islam is, and for us to develop a relationship with Allah Almighty. Now, there is no doubt that each person has this desire to read the books of the Prophet Messiah, all of them, or if a person does not know Urdu, then to read all of the English translations that are available. However, the grandness, the largeness of the task, the number of volumes that there are, that can sometimes be overwhelming. And so to simply have a desire usually is not sufficient to be able to reach a goal. In fact, what's ironic is that no matter how the greater the goal is, the more it is actually discouraging. If we have a task of reading 23 volumes, or if we have a task of reading a large number of books, then the greatness of that task actually sometimes discourages us from doing it. Because of how great it is, because of how much commitment it involves. And so, in this way, this mentality can actually condemn us to mediocrity. That we only take up those tasks which seem easy, which seem like something that are within our willpower to accomplish. And so, if we go only based on our desires, then it is not sufficient. In fact, that mentality would confine us to very small and easily attainable goals. But the reason why a structure is important, that makes it possible to achieve goals that are great. And this is what this challenge, or this spiritual treasures challenge, has provided us. It has given us a structure towards this goal. It has given us a schedule. It has given us incremental progress by which we can achieve small and attainable goals until ultimately we achieve a larger goal. And so in this way we can achieve that large goal without being confined by the fear of our failure in willpower, or failure to fulfill that responsibility or fulfill that ambition. So this is a great opportunity for us in that we have a desire, and then that structure is provided for us as a group to get together and to be able to complete that challenge. So what the Khuddam are doing is that they've assigned a certain number of pages. It only comes out to a few pages a day, and it requires perhaps less than 10 or 5 minutes to read on a daily basis. And even if a person has not kept up with their reading, it's not something that's so ominous that a person cannot crash study on the last day and catch up on the reading on the day when everyone gets together to discuss it. Another advantage of this is that there's a conference call about each month, wherein that book that was under study during that month is discussed. An overview is given, questions are answered, and also people share their different points on what they found interesting and enlightening. So this gives us a beautiful structure to read the books of the promised Messiah ﷺ, to take an objective that we already want to achieve and make it easier for us to attain and give us a motivation to participate in it. Also, this challenge is one that, since the books of the promised Messiah ﷺ are divided into so many smaller books, it's not that whole volumes are covered at once. So a person, I think, can join at any point as well without having to pick up halfway through a book. And so in this way, even if a person missed the boat in the beginning, they can still pick up on wherever everyone is reading and still keep up with the discussion. This last discussion that we had was on the book of the Promised Messiah, which has been published and translated under the name The Green Announcement, which was originally published as a discourse on the demise of Bashir. And I'd just like to share a couple of points from this so that we can get an idea of what it is that the Promised Messiah is conveying to us and how we can derive different points from it that can become a means of broadening our understanding. Now, in this book, and some of the discussions some of the points that we discussed together as those who have read this book have to do with the basic message that the Promised Messiah is communicating in this book. And what he is communicating, the context and the background of this book, is that after the prophecy of Muslim Maud that Masih Maud had made, in which he had said that a son would be born to him with certain qualities within a certain number of years. After that, he had a son who was known in the Jamaat as Bashir Awal, but that child passed away. And so on this, the opponents of the Promised Messiah spread misunderstandings by trying to say that this Bashir Awal was supposed to be the promised reformer, and that by his passing away, the prophecy of the Promised Messiah was proven false. So this is the essence of why this book was written in the first place. Now, there are different points that the Masih Maud gives in this book. The first point that he makes is a sort of technical discussion on refuting the arguments of those who have made false accusations against him, by proving that they have only taken half quotations, they have cherry-picked references without context, and proving that they have deliberately sought to deceive people by misrepresenting his prophecies. However, after this, the Promised Messiah goes into the philosophy of why this trial came upon the Jamaat, why it is that Allah Ta'ala makes these situations come about and what the wisdom is behind it. And so in this way, we gain a great deal of spiritual lessons from what the Promised Messiah describes here. So what is important to remember is that when reading the books of the Promised Messiah, it is not only a historical lesson. The historical lessons are important. Knowing the life and the events of the life of the Promised Messiah is very important. But it is not just a historical lesson that we gain. And also it is not just arguments that we learn. Learning answers to objections that are made by opponents of the Promised Messiah is also a very important thing that we gain from reading these books. However, the real essence is those ruhani khazain, those spiritual treasures, that which we gain in our spirituality from this. And this is something that is a blessing of reading the writings of a person who is a prophet of God, who is someone who is permeated with the love of God. The fact is that when someone like the Promised Messiah writes a book, then that person's essence is filled with the love of Allah Almighty. And no matter what subject he is discussing, that subject ultimately comes back and leads in a way to spiritual development and love of Allah Almighty, how we can improve our condition and the condition of those around us. And so this is one important point to keep in mind always when reading these books, and also a strong motivational factor to get involved in the reading of these books. Now, one point that Hazrat Masih Maud makes is he describes the capacities that children have. And this teaches us an interesting lesson on the importance of our capacities and the importance of training children as well. Now, we are familiar in Islam that we are taught that all children who, God forbid, die in a young age, they go to paradise because they are a clean slate. They are sinless. They did not make any mistake. They did not sin deliberately in and of themselves. And so we are taught that since they are not developed yet in their spiritual capacities, when they pass away, they are entrusted to Hazrat Ibrahim in paradise. That under the guidance of this prophet, they're in their premature spiritual capacities develop under his nurturing care. However, this may lead a person to believe that children are completely innocent and that there is no negative effect that can be had on them. But this is a point that the Promised Messiah points out to us in this book, to remember to not take this interpretation too far. Now here, what Hazrat Masih Maud describes is that about his son Bashir Awal, it was revealed to him that this was a child of high and great capacities. And Hazrat Masih Maud writes that in general, he writes, and I am convinced that every child that comes into the world, whether it dies in infancy or reaches an old age, is different from all others on account of its natural and inherent powers. This can be clearly seen from the differences in their aptitude, behavior, appearance, and intellect. So here the Hazrat Masih Maud starts to point out one important factor here, that just because all children are a clean slate in the sight of Allah Almighty, just because they are judged according to their circumstances and their capacities and they are sinless, but it does not mean that all children are identical. But each has its own unique capacity. And this capacity has to do with physical capacities, spiritual and intellectual capacities. For example, some children are born physically larger than others, and as they grow, they have a different bone structure, a different muscle mass. They're physically more capable of lifting more weight, of just being more physically capable. They're more athletically inclined. This is just a part of their genes. It has to do with physical capacity. There's nothing that you or I can change about that. However, this does not mean that those children that do not have those same physical capacities are in some way incapacitated, that they are somehow not on the same human level. All it means is that somebody who has more muscle mass, someone who has a different bone structure, they would find it easier to become an athlete, for example. We would be able to do the same tasks, but someone who has less physical development would have to struggle a little bit harder for it. We can all become athletes, but some have to struggle less and some have to struggle more. And this also applies to intellectual capacities. Some have more and a higher intellectual capacity than others. Some children, they absorb information and they have to study for less of a time than others. And these capacities and differences in those capacities exist. Now again, this doesn't mean that that child who is of a lower intellectual capacity can't achieve the same. We can all become a doctor if we wanted to. It's just that some people have to work harder than others at. Now this same thing applies to spiritual capacities as well. That in spirituality we all have different capacities. And that capacity is ingrained into us from the time of our infancy. And it is a part of our nature. However, these are also influenced by our nurture as well. By the way and environment in which we are raised. Our physical capacities are influenced by the food that we take in. By the environment and the different exposures that we have as a child. For example, a child who is if during the child's development, if the child's mother used some types of drugs, for example, or if the child was exposed to some negative influences very early on in their infancy, it has subtle effects on their physical and intellectual development which stunts that growth to an extent. So our nurture affects these capacities. And so a child suffers and is disadvantaged because of the environment that they are raised in. This also applies to spiritual capacities as well. The spiritual capacities of our children develop according to the way in which we train those children, according to the circumstances that we expose them to. This is why Islam has emphasized right from the beginning to be mindful of the spiritual development of our children right from the beginning. The Holy Prophet ﷺ has taught a prayer that our children be saved from harm and satanic influences when a husband and wife meet together, so that from the very time of conception, the children and their spiritual capacities are looked after. Then when a child is born, the first thing is that azan is said into their ears, takbir and azan. And then also, even while the child is in the womb, there are different things that parents can do for the spiritual development of that child. It is narrated about Hazrat Ghulam Rasul Rajiki and perhaps about Hazrat Maulvi Sher Ali as well, that in both of these families it was a narration or it was a tradition that when women were expecting them, they would recite the Holy Quran with a much higher level of frequency, so they would have a positive influence on the spiritual development of the child. And what's interesting is that Hazrat Ghulam Rasul Rajiki says that I do not recall having ever made a conscious effort to memorize Surah Yasin. But it seems to me that since my mother recited it with such frequency when she was expecting me, that perhaps it somehow got ingrained into my mind so that it never actually happened where I had to sit down and memorize it verse by verse or word by word as others do. So when a child is in the womb, there are spiritual influences that are happening as a result of the behavior of that child's mother. If a child's mother is involving herself in spiritual pursuits, if she's reciting the Holy Quran or doing other good activities to try and keep her mind and her body pure during that time, then it has a good influence on the child. However, if a mother is not mindful of her diet, if she spends her entire time sitting down and watching movies and that's her whole intake psychologically and spiritually during that time, it is definitely going to have a negative influence on the spirituality of that child. Then also the environment children are raised in, whether infants or childhood. If they are raised in a good and a happy household, it has one influence. If it is a dysfunctional household, then that has a negative influence on that child. So these are all negative and positive aspects. What this shows us is that each child is unique in its capacities. And it is not just in its nature, but it is in their nurture as well. And we are responsible for that. You and I, as adults, whatever circumstances we find ourselves in, we try to strive according to those circumstances. And we are not accountable for any disadvantage we have. If we have some disadvantage that we have, then we have to work against it. Allah Ta'ala does not hold us accountable for it. And this is a general principle in Islam. So this is not a principle that applies to children. That's a separate principle. For example, the promised Messiah, he had one companion who was born and raised in a family or perhaps a tribe of people who were robbers, who were thieves. And so for him, when he decided that he did not want to be a thief and he did not want to be a robber, it was actually a point of praise for him that he decided to not steal, to not rob people. And it resulted in him being ostracized from his family. It was something that was praiseworthy about him. However, someone else, for example, who may have been raised in the home of a companion of the promised Messiah, who may have been raised in a good environment, for him it's no point of being happy, no point of celebration, no point of praise that he decides that he's not going to steal or rob people. That's not something that we are worthy of praise for. So what this shows is that in the sight of Allah Almighty, whatever circumstances that we find ourselves in, when we reach an age where we have free choice, we are judged according to those circumstances. We are not judged because of the disadvantages that our parents or our environment placed us in. If we were raised among a family of robbers and thieves, then we will be judged accordingly. We will not be judged as harshly. If we were raised among a family of extremely righteous people, then more will be expected of us. With great privilege comes great responsibility. That is a separate subject within this subject of responsibility. However, what the promised Messiah is describing here is that when we are raising our children, they have not reached a point of taking responsibility for their actions yet. However, the disadvantages and the advantages that they will face later on is something that we decide with our nurturing, with the environment that we expose them to and with the capacities that we develop them within them. And so we can decide to a great extent as parents whether our children will be at a greater disadvantage when they reach an age of being able to make their own free choices, whether they will have to overcome more obstacles than others, or if they will be more advantaged when it comes to spirituality, if they will have a greater capacity to gain nearness to Allah Almighty with less obstacles. This is what the promised Messiah describes here in this book, where he says that the Islamic teaching about the children of the disbelievers who pass away in their infancy is also based on this very principle. And their natures are considered imperfect because al-waladu sirru li-abihi, that like father, like son, a child who is raised in the home of a disbeliever, he does not become a disbeliever in that sense that he deliberately chose to be a disbeliever. However, a child that is raised within that environment, that home, within that negative sort of general atmosphere that is not conducive towards the spiritual development that Islam has guided parents to create from the very beginning, that child faces disadvantages that a person would otherwise not have to face. And so these are obstacles that come in their way that are preventable, that that child has to then encounter. So one lesson that we learn from this aspect of discussion that the promised Messiah has discussed is a responsibility of parents. The promised Messiah received revelations about this son of his, Bashir Awwal, that he had perfect capacities, he had great capacities within him, and that he had the potential for great righteousness within him, that the nature that was created within him was something that was exceptional from Allah Almighty. And not only that, but the home that he was being raised in, the womb that he spent his time in, and the home that he was born into, and the environment that he spent his infancy in, it was such a balanced and perfect and beautiful atmosphere that had he grown to adulthood, he had great potentials and advantages. And so these were inherent capacities that were placed within that child, capacities that exist whether that child reaches at a stage of adulthood or not. And so in this we find a spiritual lesson, a sort of spiritual treasure that we can say from this example of Bashir Awwal, a child who passed away in his infancy, who was the son of the promised Messiah, which is that although children are a clean slate, although children are pure, however, that does not mean that they are not influenced by what we do around them, what we say around them. Even infants, even children who are in the womb, what they hear, what they witness, what they feel that is happening between their parents, between the family that is around them, the exposure that is given to them, what they hear and what they see. All of these things have a subtle influence. And these are things to be mindful of. Because Each person has a free choice. But what we do not have a free choice in is the subtle advantages and disadvantages in the circumstances that we come into. And so therein, the promised Messiah ﷺ has taught us that for our children to try and nurture them in a way where they have the greatest advantages in life. And then also to remember another point, which is that we ourselves should expose ourselves to such an environment that is conducive to our spiritual growth. Even when we reach an age of adulthood, even when we reach an age where we are able to make free choices, when we are in our teens, when we are in our early 20s, even then parts of our brain are developing, where if a person gets into certain habits, is conditioned towards certain types of reward and punishments, gets into a certain type of pleasure, then that leaves a lasting mark on that person's mind which takes time to remove, which takes time to reverse. Our brains are plastic in a way in that they develop according to our actions. The environment that we choose to expose ourselves to, the actions that we do, they slowly develop us in a way that we become a manifestation and a personification of the sum total of our actions. And so we are nurturing our children every day, and we are nurturing ourselves every day. And al-waladu sirru li abihi, that like father, like son. As parents, we are influencing our children, and then our actions and our environment are influencing us. And so this is one interesting point from this book of a discourse on the demise of Bashir, or the green announcement, which has to do with our spiritual development and the development of our children, and how we can be mindful towards these subtleties of our intellectual, physical, and spiritual capacities, and how to develop them, and how to be mindful and save ourselves from squandering them. May Allah Almighty help us to strengthen our capacities so that we can use them towards gaining nearness to Him. الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. There are a few announcements. Waqf Jadid year is ending on December 31st. A letter was mailed to all members stating their outstanding balance due. Please pay your balance as soon as possible. All young boys and girls can participate in Nanna Mujahid and Nanhi Mujahid scheme by paying $50 from their pocket. All parents, please help in this regard. The Central Virginia Amla meeting will be held on this Sunday at 9 o'clock a.m. All Amla members are requested to arrive by 8:45. And there is a request for prayers. The mother of Harun and Mamoon Rashid Sahib is critically ill and in ICU. All members are requested to pray for her full and speedy recovery. Similarly, Sahibzada Tahir Latif Sahib, Abdul Samid Jadran Sahib, Munir Khan Sahib, Mansoor Pal Sahib, and Sister Askari Chaudhary Sahiba are also not feeling well. Please remember them in your prayers. We will offer Namaz-e-Janaza Ghaib of Mr. Muhammad Aslam Sahib, brother of Munawar Awan Sahib, and father-in-law of Mudassar Awan Sahib of Central Virginia, who has passed away in Pakistan at the age of 72. May Allah grant him the high status in paradise, and may He grant Sabr Jameel to his family. All Central Virginia Ansar who have not done the Taaleem test are requested to meet after Jummah on the right side next to the chairs. Our Muntazim Taaleem will be conducting the test collectively. It should not take more than 15 to 20 minutes, inshallah. Jazakallah. But also prayer times, Fajr time will change to 6:15 a.m. from tomorrow. All others will remain the same. Then also Central Virginia Ansar will hold their monthly meeting tomorrow, Saturday at 11 a.m. in the men's prayer hall at the masjid. We will do the Taaleem test collectively. Please attend. And Humanity First USA is holding their second annual telethon. I think this is from last week actually. Then finally there is a request for Namaz-e-Janaza Ghaib. The younger sister of Durre Maknoon Sayyid, wife of Dr. Anwar Ahmed Sayyid Sahib and daughter of Dr. Akhtar Mahmood Sahib passed away in Lahore, Pakistan after a sudden and brief illness on November 21st, 2014. Then also the paternal uncle, Dr. Zafar Mahmood Sahib, who was a paternal uncle of Salman Mahmood Sahib, who was a renowned dental surgeon, passed away in Birmingham, United Kingdom on December 5th, 2012. So we'll be observing the janazah ghaib of these people. Ibadallah, rahimakumullah. Inna Allah ya'muru bil adli wal ihsani wa ita'i zil qurba wa yanha 'anil fahsha'i wal munkari wal baghi ya'izukum la'allakum tazakkarun. Uzkurullaha yazkurkum wad'uhu yastajib lakum wa lazikrullahi akbar.